Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia. Listeners, I've just finished reading a remarkable book by an accomplished author, screenwriter, producer and podcaster by the name of Courtney Collins. Courtney's first novel, The Burial, was published back in 2012 in 10 countries and shortlisted for multiple prizes, including the New South Wales Premiers Literary Award and the Stella Prize. This year, Courtney's new novel, Bird, is about to be released. Now, to say that this is a novel like no other I've read would be an understatement. It's otherworldly and yet so real in its exploration of themes that include misogyny and exploitation of women. Set between the Himalayas in an unspecified time period and Darwin in the present day, Bird follows the story of a young girl who is determined to live life on her own terms. It's a story of resilience, hope, and above all, a story about connection. And Courtney is with me here today to chat about this wonderful novel. So welcome to the podcast, Courtney.
Thanks for having me, Claudine.
Congratulations on the publication of Bird. In fact, today is release day in Australia, isn't it?
It's publication day. It's a very surreal day because it's been this, lovely private thing just shared between few, you included, because you have an art copy I can see behind you. And now there's a sense of needing to release it. And, it is release day, but I think that there is something in that feeling of having to let this special thing go. Lots of feelings.
Indeed. I was going to say, are you nervous or excited, or you just relieved that it's finally out there?
I took myself on a bushwalk this morning, thinking that would be the very best thing to do, to spot some birds and seek solace in the bush. And I'm staying at my parents' place, so I'm not completely familiar with all the bushland around their place. They've only lived here for a few years. And I just got so royally lost. And I felt like I was on a pilgrimage of my own. And I really had to feel Bird all over again, because I sent her off on a pilgrimage where she's walking and walking for a very long time and unraveling to herself. So although it was kind of uncomfortable to be there again, it felt also completely appropriate to be lost in the bush. Anyway, clearly I found my way back in time to talk to you. I think it just reflects my state of mind.
Courtney, it's been a long time between your first and second novels. Was that something that you were deliberate about, or were you just occupied with other things?
I have been writing the whole time. I mean, I'm never not writing. It's my thing. I suppose technically this is my third novel, in the sense that I wrote a second novel, which has been on ice, let's say, for a while. And I'll return to that, I guess, when my promoting Bird is done. I feel like I've done what I can for that book. I moved to Southeast Arnhem Land with my partner about 9 years ago. And I set off with this idea, Claudine, that I'm a writer and I can write anywhere. And I was partway through that second novel, and I thought being in Southeast Arnhem Land and, I guess, disconnected from social pressures of my life and turning up to things would be the perfect opportunity to finish that book. It soon became apparent that things were just far too interesting for me to sit in a donga. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but it's literally a repurposed shipping container with an air conditioner slapped on the end, sitting in a donga in Southeast Arnhem Land, making up a story when things beyond my imagination were happening right outside. So I did respond to that in the way of learning pretty quickly what it is to be a producer and working with senior Indigenous storytellers to develop and produce their stories. And their stories, so the community I was in, Nooka, I think there are 8 or 9 traditional languages spoken there, or that have been spoken. So the story project aimed to, tell stories in the language that people wanted to tell them in. I think we made about 11 short films. A picture book was produced. That's what I've been up to, Claudine. I've been busy immersed in other people's stories. And I did, I guess, around that, I couldn't ignore my own need to write and create a fictional world that was satisfying to me. So that eventually pulled me back down south so I could really do that work of completing it, which I've done.
And that's such an incredible journey that you've been on. So, Courtney, I wanted to ask you, where did the idea for Bird Story come from?
So living in Southeast Arnhem Land, I think was the first real sense I'd had of being absolutely overwhelmed by the landscape in its immensity, but also in its, to do the shopping, we would drive 4 hours to Catherine. You know, to catch a flight, we would drive 9 hours to Darwin. There is something about being there and being surrounded by artists who are painting that landscape that I got to know it through their work. So when I first traveled through that country, I guess it was kind of muted and I couldn't understand it and I couldn't see the colors in it. And then as the seasons changed, I saw, you know, this incredible pink in the landscape and incredible greens and incredible purples. And as well as that, well, I guess a part of the experience of living in the Arts Centre in Nooka was that I got to hear the stories around the paintings. So I think that idea, which is a very Indigenous idea of stories connected to landscape, was really the life that I found myself in. At the same time, or during that time, I went to the Himalayas. I went to Himachal Pradesh, the northern Indian state, on an Asia Link fellowship to do some research on this book that was forming. And it seems like, you know, what is, I guess the question is, what is the connection between Southeast Arnhem Land and the Himalayas? But again, it was another incomprehensible landscape that really just created such a space of imagining for me. And I knew that the novel was about a girl, and I knew she was on a pilgrimage. And I love that the Himalayas, you know, for so many people, for so many religions, is an awe-inspiring place that many people of many religious persuasions and non-religious persuasions hold the Himalayas with a sense of awe. It wasn't like the book came from the spark of one idea. It was like a coalescing of immense feeling and needing to train it into a line that I could explore. And I think the line that I wanted to explore was connection and asking myself, how is Bird, the character of Bird, connected to the place she's in, the people who are around her, and what does that mean for her when these experiences of life keep repeating for her? So as you would know, the novel is told in, I guess, dual timelines between present day Darwin and the past in the Himalayas, as you say, an unnamed year. And it is about trauma, I think, ricocheting through lifetimes, and a girl and a woman trying to make sense of that as a way to circumvent it.
I guess I just wanted to try and understand why the Himalayas. I mean, yes, you talked about connection and you've talked about the fact that, you know, the Himalayan area is so awe-inspiring for so many people. But did the idea of Bird come fully formed as somebody that lived in that region? Or was that more a result of you being there and thinking about your story and then deciding that she could very well have lived in that landscape?
That's an excellent question. And I honestly, I don't know what came first, except to say years ago, the Dalai Lama was talking about the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama. And he said something very controversial. A reporter asked him, could the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama be female? And he said, only if she's good looking. And I was completely appalled by the Dalai Lama's words. And I thought about this idea of the Dalai Lama being incarnate as a young woman. And would she be taken seriously? We don't seem to be able to take young women seriously. There was certainly a connection with pilgrimage and reincarnation, and I guess this gripe, a gripe I'd like to take up with the Dalai Lama. And as part of that research, I did travel to McLeod Ganj, where the Dalai Lama's residence is. And of course, you're at, the foothills of the Himalayas while you're there. And there are monks and nuns walking around. It feels like they are the main population. And I got, I guess, an experience of seeing that the living conditions of the monks were quite different to the living conditions of the nuns, and that still in this day, the monks were able to research and learn the holy texts while the nuns were doing their washing. So I think there's something about, probably as a young woman, abandoning my own cultural, spiritual early life, which was Irish Catholic, and seeking Buddhism as some kind of solace, and then just being gravely disappointed with it and seeing the same patriarchy, the same misogyny, the same man-made structures. So to cast it in the Himalayas, I think I do connect the Himalayas with my own seeking, if you like.
And you bring up so many fascinating points there that I want to delve in a little bit later. But I mean, suffice it to say that Bird was an incredible character in both these timelines. She was someone who wasn't content with her lot in life, and she was determined to break free from the fate that she was destined for. And as someone so young, it struck me that she had remarkable insight into her situation. So I wondered if you could talk more about why this was something you wanted to explore through Bird.
My thinking was that she has lived many lifetimes, although she has the experience of being a young woman in this present life, and she's underestimated, and the adults around her are severely letting her down. The novel is told in the second person because I wanted Bird's consciousness to speak to her. So the voice is the consciousness of Bird becoming apparent to her. So the reader learns about Bird as Bird is learning about Bird. And I think it goes back to this gripe, I think, of feeling that young women are grossly underestimated in their self-knowledge and imagination and personal insight. And perhaps because it's not articulated or there isn't a forum to express it, I really wanted to give her, I mean, what Bird in this lifetime experiences, I think, keenly is disappointment and a sense that things shouldn't be as they are. And she doesn't quite know what to do about that, but she's propelled to connect. She's propelled to change her situation, whatever way she can. And I think when a young woman has been severely let down by adults, it's kind of upon her to, find her own way through it as best she can. And I feel like Bird does that clumsily at times and illegally at other times, but her spirit is moving her through.
As you spoke about, and I spoke about in my introduction, the novel is an exploration of connection. There are invisible fibers that connect Bird in the present day and Himalayan Bird in the past. They share memories, feelings, and even special gifts. They are two young women who are connected over space and time in a way that can be difficult, I think, for some people to comprehend. But I think and you mentioned this earlier, if you believe in reincarnation, perhaps it's not so hard to comprehend. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, I think depending on your belief system, depending if you're Buddhist or Hindu or Jain or Sikh or none of those religions will, I guess, affect how you approach the book and regard it as a magic realism or mystery or just how things are. So for me, I don't not believe in reincarnation, but I don't necessarily believe in it either. So it was absolutely an imaginative exercise. And it probably came more out of that feeling of thinking maybe it takes lifetimes for some relationships to be worked out. That feeling is very real and true to me. I guess I followed the strength of that feeling through.
Do you think that we're destined to live the same life over and over?
I sincerely hope not. I suppose I have to quote Oprah. She says, it's the same problem in a different pair of pants. And it's like, you have to get the lesson. And if you don't get the lesson, it's just going to come by again. So it's really upon Bird in this lifetime to get the lesson. And I don't want to name what the lesson is because I feel like that's a spoiler. But I think there's another expression, the obstacle is the way, that the obstacles, the challenges that we're presented, they're to be faced and embraced. And I think that's how we evolve. Repetition can be nightmarish, and I think there's something about trauma that I did want to explore in this novel, in the way that trauma can and does ricochet through lifetimes, whatever belief system, you hold, that whether you want to call that intergenerational trauma, we inherit things, and sometimes for no fault of our own, it's upon us to work it out. That's Bird's load, I'm afraid.
You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but certainly one of the themes that you've explored in this book is the innate vulnerability of women, young women who, like Himalayan Bird, are traded, sold, or auctioned off at the whim of their fathers, no better than a farm animal, really. Women who are kidnapped off the streets and sold as slaves. The fundamental disregard for a woman's life and her self-determination is breathtaking in some of the scenes in this book. We even see fear and superstition being used by men to control women as well. But this isn't, something that's confined to third world countries or intrinsically patriarchal cultures like the ones that you've, written about. This is something that women in so-called modern societies face too. And we see this in present day Darwin for Bird. She's under constant fear of being molested by her mother's boyfriend and places herself in harm's way just to get away from him, to avoid being alone with him. Why was this something you wanted to explore in the novel?
Australia really has a problem in terms of male violence against women. The statistics of women being harmed and losing their lives through domestic and partner-related violence is really something we have to be clear-sighted about and face in this country. It's happening now. So I just don't think that we can shy away from it and think that, because we're a rich, developed country, that we don't have a lot of work to do.
I want to talk about the structure of the novel. Structure is always something that I love talking about with authors. You flip between the two timelines, the two different Bird characters, but you also, as you mentioned, use the second person point of view. Now, it's not often that I read a book with second person point of view, and you've not only used it across one timeline, but you've used it across both. Was that a conscious decision on your part? Was this something that you really wanted to do? And did you experiment with it and decide if it was going to work or not?
I started in a very early draft. I was telling the story through the point of view of a spirit who I thought of as Bird's protector. The way that evolved was that the protector wanted urgently for Bird to realize the connection between this present life and this past life so that she might break the cycle, the repeating disappointments and betrayals. But the problem with the spirit narrator was that it was very disembodied. And I brought that voice to Bird in the sense that the protector became her rising consciousness, if you like. And it was really important for me that Bird held this innate wisdom, if you like, that was surfacing in her to, the extent that she could allow it and comprehend it. That was how I became committed to the second person as a point of view, and I guess a narrative technique that's usually comes with, warnings. Once I realized it was Bird's consciousness, it cohered for me, and I guess there was no turning back after that.
Okay, so sense of place was something that you evoked so beautifully in this novel too. And you talked a little bit about your time in the Himalayas and obviously your time in Arnhem Land as well. I mean, as bitterly cold, barren and bleak as the Himalayan landscapes were for the most part of Bird's pilgrimage to the Holy Mountain, Darwin was hot, humid, oppressive, really, and Bird was constantly plagued by mosquitoes. What did you do to bring these kind of experiences to the page?
That humidity and the mosquitoes and that feeling of, being on a swamp. I was in the NT for 8 years, and in terms of, our climate crisis and the weather, there are days that you experience there that you feel like you might not survive. And that sounds grossly exaggerated, but it's just so hot and it's getting hotter. I think that discomfort, that extreme discomfort of being bitten and being too hot to think. I think how it works on the body is that being hot for so long, you really get in touch with your anger, Claudine. It is a kind of there is a blood boiling that happens, and in the NT, there's a period of time, the build up that's called mango madness, and people are very, have a very short wick, let's say, and I experienced that. So that was easy to evoke because I had lived it for a long time. And I think in making, the world of the Himalayas distinct, part of that was about, contrasting that environment to the Himalayas.
It occurred to me that in both timelines, we have similarly named characters. I mean, we've got Teshi in both. I don't know if that's how we say his name, but
That's
so
correct.
we've got a Teshi in both of those timelines as well. And both of these Teshis are quasi protectors of Bird, and somebody that she ends up kind of wanting to get away from, really. Can you talk to me a little bit about that relationship and why it was important to Bird's overall journey?
Teshi, I love as a character. He's a tender young man whose loyalty remains with his mother. And there's a certain sense of guilt that he carries through lifetimes, which we come to understand. In terms of romance and connection, I feel like the untold stories of romance are the ones that seem so fated and yet just will never work. And it seemed that for me, the most loving thing that those two characters could do was to begin the difficult work of letting each other go. There is a sense of this young man feeling like he has to protect this young woman because of something that's happened in the past. And it's stifling for him, and he's saying yes to everything that she asks of him to his great detriment. And his mother, is clearly not a fan of Bird because she sees her teenage son, I suppose, unable to say no to her, and she says, she wants more for her son than to hook up with a young woman with a death wish. There is something about an eternal love and an eternal disappointment that they share, and that's its own kind of romance, isn't it?
Courtney, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
The intention was to explore connection. And in my process and lived experience around that process, there was a real shift for me in, I suppose, landing in Southeast Arnhem Land, with a preference for sad stories and existential literature and things that seem to reiterate this idea that we're born alone and we die alone. And yet, in the community that I was in, people believed that we're born connected and we die connected. I really did my best to let that in, and as I did, it's quite terrifying to give up one belief system for another. But as I did, and over time, it became more expansive, I think, and invited me to be braver in my life, and invited me to, I suppose, think about relationships differently and how I wanted to center them in my life, and not just relationships with humans, but with creatures and with my environment, and how to take care of things in a way that honored our connection. So if I would love readers to take something, I think it's perhaps an openness to that idea.
Courtney, I understand that your first novel, The Burial, is being adapted for film. Are you able to tell us anything about that?
I think I can say this. That Olivia de Jong has been cast as Jessie. Olivia de Jong, she's an incredible Australian actress. So she was Priscilla in the Elvis film, in Baz's Elvis film. And other I guess amazing castings for me that just beyond my kind of wildest dreams. So hopefully it goes into production next year. It's just in its last kind of process of securing the necessary funding. It costs a lot of money to make films, and especially films with horses. You don't think about that when you're writing a novel. You're just sending everyone off on horseback and up the mountain and down the mountain, but put that on film and that becomes a very expensive film to make. So soon, and more soon, yes.
Fantastic. Will you be involved in the production in any way, like on script writing or anything like
I've
that?
been involved, yeah. I've been involved in the script writing, which has been really satisfying actually, because when the novel was first optioned, I just spent 7 years in it. I didn't want to go near it. And a wonderful writer, Polly Watkins, wrote the screenplay. And, a screenplay goes through so many drafts and iterations. And John Coley was brought in as well. And I mean, the interesting thing about a film that's been in development for a long time is that you get to ask the question of, how does this story meet the time we're in now? And things have shifted, There are elements, there are themes in the novel that may have been in the background that are now in the foreground. And I was really delighted to do some work on bringing those forward without kind of giving too much away. But yeah, so I was involved in the rewrites of the latest draft with Polly Watkins.
How fantastic. That must have been so
Yeah.
exciting for you.
It was, in that I love Jessie. I love Jessie. I want to see her large, and there is nothing quite like film to make a character large, is there? And to imagine Olivia de Jong in that role, and her physicality and her grit and her style, I think it's a film that I really want to see,
Courtney, as I mentioned in my introduction, you're also a host of a podcast called Are You Still Working? What made you want to start this podcast?
It started, I guess this phrase, "Are you still working?" was something that my nan would say to me when I would visit her. "Are you still working?" And I realized that despite telling her over a long period of time, telling her about the work that I do, she didn't really think of it as a real job. And, my family is working class, they earn a wage, and that is their reality. An artist or a writer with who's constantly shifting from project, and it all looks very boom and bust and precarious. It's like, what does she even do? So I really wanted to explore the creative life of women artists, especially because I didn't want women's work, creative work, to be, again, part of the unseen work that women do. And yet so much of the work of an artist and a writer happens unseen. It has to, that's where it happens. So I was really interested to know how other women, I guess, negotiated those cultural forces to empower themselves to do the work, and not only do the work one time, but again and again. And when the work wasn't working, So that's the question I get to ask incredibly accomplished people, incredibly accomplished women. What do you do when the work isn't working? And it's research from myself. And so I can take that in my own quiet hours when things aren't working and remember what Charlotte Wood said, or what Holly Ringland said, or what Laura Jean said, you know, and they come to me now like fairy godmothers, you know, in at the right time. Those incredible insights they have about their own process and their own struggles. So, you know, my producer Lisa Madden and I, after the end of every conversation, we just actually walk away going, they just handed us gold. Like, how did that happen? You know, is it that people, certainly the women that we've interviewed, are so insightful? I just, the only thing that I guess pains me is, what if we'd never asked them that question? You know, it seemed to kind of unlock so much wisdom about the process. I guess I'm thinking about that because it's publication day and I've got a bunch of events coming up and I get to focus on the beautiful thing that I've made. And so much of the work and the conversation is about the beautiful thing that gets made. And I really wanted to look at the back of that and go, what happened? How did you do that? So that's what it's about.
I love that, because that's also what fascinates me. People like you, like Holly, like a million other female artists out there have to overcome in order to produce what they produce. It's a reality for so many women that they have to balance so many different obstacles that potentially male creatives don't have to face in their everyday life. And so it just seems that women have so many more obstacles to overcome in order to continue to produce the work that they do.
There's stifling forces, and you know, there's the tangible accounting for time spent on unseen work, but I think there's also something about self-esteem and how you actually back yourself to do that work if you haven't been told by the mainstream culture that it's of value. How you find your own source of self-regard, which is actually a beautiful book by Toni Morrison, a collection of essays, you know, the source of self-regard. And clearly she found it early, but it is this sense of, when you don't have people telling you from a young age, or the culture reminding you from a young age that you're special or important, or you could do this thing, how women and girls find their way to that.
Courtney, you might know that there are many writers who listen to this podcast, and as such, given your experiences as a published author and a podcaster and producer, I wondered if you had any advice that you could pass on.
So one of the things I was conscious of when I was writing Bird was the rules of fiction that I was telling myself or reminding myself about. And these rules are rules that I'd learned in workshops and in doing a master's in creative writing and reading all the books. And I thought, what if I find an alternative to those rules? Because I wanted to tell a story about connection, and I wanted to tell a story about intergenerational trauma, and these rules don't seem to be fit for purpose. So I think the thing I would really want to reiterate is, find the right tools and be suspicious of the rules because nobody knows except you the book you want to write and what your intention is and the line of inquiry you want to explore. So it's upon you to find the right tools to fulfill that purpose. One of the, I guess, the gifts of being in the Northern Territory and teaching creative writing to Indigenous students was that I became very aware of the way I was parroting these rules, and that they just did not apply and were not appropriate in that cultural setting. You know, to say show don't tell, or you know, your story needs a beginning, middle, and an end, was like, you know what, just ignore that and find another way. And I think one of the most, I guess, enduring creative forces is, I guess, the ability to, offer yourself a place to reflect on yourself and your intentions for the work and let that be your guide. Yeah, that's what I would say. to summarize that. Tools, not rules.
Tools, not rules. I don't think anyone has given us a tip like that before. And thank you very much for sharing.
My pleasure.
So what's next for you, Courtney? What are you working on now?
At the end of August, I'm flying to Dublin to do a workshop with Claire Keegan, which I'm so excited about. Claire Keegan is, I guess a literary crush. I think she's an incredible writer. I love what she says about elegance in prose. She says, elegance is basically writing just enough. And that has been a very helpful guide for me. After the workshop, I'm doing some research on my next novel, which is the novel that has been on ice. I think in letting it sit for a while, I've realised what has to happen, and some of it happens in Dublin, actually. So off I'll go.
Well, Courtney, what a delight it's been to speak to you about this spellbinding novel. I absolutely loved it. I want to say happy publication day once again, and thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.